your pickup and all those things are worked out now. So all you need to do is reach GIA and you get picked up from there, get dropped back. Um, Thursday is when you have preferably chosen as the time, which is actually good. A lot of our events, activities on campus might be happening on that day. Uh, and the purpose really is for you to take the time that you need to immerse yourself in what's happening on campus. Actually, in many cases, it's the other way around. Students who are staying here, they're staying in a residential space, and all they have is basically this campus, right, to do what they need to do. And we try as much as possible when we are teaching to take them outside the campus, whether it's in the neighborhood or to Delhi, for activities, experiential learning, anything that we might plan as part of a course. But since it's a development practice focused course, what you want to also do is make the most of your time on campus by engaging with scholars who are visiting us, and this is open for any school as well. So it's not as if that we have to design and curate something for you to attend something. If there is you all have emails coming out on what events are happening. So if there's something of interest you have, which maybe is not on a Thursday, but you want to come attend it. So the shuttle service is available. You guys can sort of come in. Just inform either Nasima or Saqib. These are the two people in the executive team. You all know them by now. So be in touch with them. We just want to know that you've come in and everything is all okay. The other is, as you know, Professor Prachi and Professor Nayan, Professor Gayatri, I see Professor Abhinita is also here. So we will have faculty who is present on most of the times when you're coming on campus. So we'll have a curated list of things that we would plan. So I think today you have a visit to the library. You make the most of your time right there. You might as well want to see some of the other facilities, including the sports academy, things that you might just want to see and get a sense of what the campus experience is like. And with every month, since we have one visit planned every month, we will try to make this as interesting as possible, because you're coming all the way. So thank you so much for coming, first of all. And with that, I'll give the space to Professor Prachi. And thank you so much, Sumeet, for agreeing to do this with us, especially at this time. A lot of the students are not on campus for this week because we had a technical glitch with the air conditioning system. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dipanshu. And good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Office of Interdisciplinary Studies, Ideas, I'd like to welcome you all to today's Reading Circle session. It's the first of the semester, and we did quite a few of these sessions last semester. The Reading Circle is part of the office's student engagement initiatives in order to add to the university's already very vibrant culture when it comes to discussions and critical discourse. So that's basically the idea behind these sessions. I'm very, very thankful to Professor Sumeet Mhaskar, who very graciously agreed to discuss a very recent and very interesting text of his today. Professor Mhaskar is a professor at JSGP, the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy. He's a sociologist, which I'm not sure would be the right way to categorize him, but that's what the JGU website says. He did his PhD, DPhil from Oxford, and before that he was at JNU for his MPhil and MA. I just got to know that he was at Center for Political Studies, so we share something there. He's also the recipient of various fellowships at renowned institutions such as Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity, Stanford University, Göttingen University, and Castle University. His research he's written a lot, and his research is really interesting. We all are very familiar with it. He works basically on themes related to labor, industrialization, migration, caste, and so on. The text that we'll be discussing, the essay that we'll be discussing today, that Professor will be discussing today, came out in a very recently edited volume titled Dalit Journeys for Dignity. And it's very interesting. I hope some of you got a chance to take a look at it, because Professor looks at the relationship or the interplay between caste and occupations in the textile industry of Bombay over a very long period. It's an impressive period of say over 130 years. Starts from 1870 and goes on to the first decade of this century. So a lot of arguments which I found really interesting, but that is for Professor to discuss. But two things that I would just like to point out. One is how succinctly the arguments have been put forth in the text. It's so lucid to read that it cuts across disciplinary boundaries. So someone who's not a reader or a student who does not come from a very hardcore social sciences or liberal arts background, it's very easy for them to grasp the text as well. It was a very interesting read. I read it this morning. That's one. And the second is the different sources that Professor has used to come to those arguments. So starting from the data from the British census, and then, from late 19th to early 20th century, but also the interviews and surveys he himself conducted in the first few years of the century. So it's a very long and impressive period. And now I'd really request Professor to sort of discuss some of the key arguments. But just a request here, since our MSc students are here, in our program we have a lot of courses that look at, say, research methods, research design, and how to conduct fieldwork. So if you could sort of focus on the methodology aspect of it as well, like, because you covered a really long, impressive period, how you sort of dug deeper into the data and how you all just went through it. If you faced any problems, especially while doing fieldwork and so on and so forth. So thank you, Professor, for being here with us.
Thank you, Prachi. First of all, for this invitation, Dipanshu is not here. He's a good friend. It's been a couple of years that I'm in Jindal now. And this is one of the very interesting initiatives Prachi has taken. So I must congratulate her for that. Because this is something we really look forward to in Jindal in terms of developing the research environment. And such initiatives actually bring a research life to the university. So in addition to the kind of degrees that you will get, it's also important that you're surrounded by research which is done over a longer period of time, and not some very quick, fast production these days. So I'm glad, actually. So thank you, Prachi, also for that generous introduction. So what I'll do is I will, of course, talk about this particular paper that was circulated. And before that, I'll just spend like 2-3 minutes talking generally about my area of research. So now it's nearly 20 years that I've been working on Mumbai city, the textile mills, and the labor itself. My initial focus has been on joblessness. So from 1998 to 2006, all the textile mills in Mumbai closed down. And my interest began with the closure of mills and what exactly workers did after they lost their jobs. So in terms of that focus, it was mostly about return migration. People went back to villages. So that's my book now, and I want to finish that as soon as possible. So one part is about return migration, going back to villages. So, abrupt journey. So people would go back to villages anyway, but this is abruptly they have to now, because of closure, they have to go back to villages. The second part, which is divided in 3 parts, is about occupational choices. So exactly what I will do here for longer period, but only focusing on the post-industrial context, looking at gender, caste, and religion, and how they shape newer job opportunities after the closure of factories. And the last part is about political mobilization, and then there are 2-3 chapters in that. So in Mumbai, there is a very unique case about the textile mill workers demanding, not demanding, but there was a provision for housing for them. And then political mobilization started in 2006. So nearly 21,000 workers have been allocated subsidized housing in the heart of Mumbai city. And each of these flats cost nearly 70 lakhs or 1 crore, and they have been given it for 10 lakh rupees. So that's the broad story that I tracked down in my PhD thesis, and which is now, after a long period, I'm wrapping up as a book manuscript. So while I was working on the occupational choices back in 2010, when I was writing my chapters after the field work, so this is something always that troubled me, that I wanted to look at the long history of the occupational choices. So the roots of this project goes back to 2010, when I began thinking about how do I connect the dots for over a period of 135 years. So back then I did not have access to the census records, which are from 1870 to 1931. 41 are a little bit disputed, so 1931. So methodologically, again, as I said, I'll come. And that's how the idea began. And during COVID, all of us were stuck at home. And I thought, and that is when I got access to the data. And I began calculating the numbers and using all kinds of various sources to write down this paper. And this is the project now I will continue further. So to give just like a brief idea, so there are 135 years of history here. So first layer that I look at are the occupations. Like there are, let's say, 10 departments, and I'm interested in looking at who works in each department, depending on their gender, religion, caste, or ethnicity, and how these 10 departments change over a period of 135 years. Okay, so what right now is missing are the technological shifts, which I really mention very briefly in this chapter. But this is what I'm going to spend another year collecting the data on exactly, let's say, these broadly 10 departments, what exactly shifts came and on which moment in history, and how that had impact on the social relations inside the factory and outside the factory both. So it's a long history, both. So it is an economic history of a textile industry of 135 years. It's a history also of occupational shifts in general, like some occupations became bigger, some became smaller, depending on the technological transformations. Then on the third hand, it's also a labor history of work in the cotton textile industry. And then it also talks about various social institutions. So there are various layers. What I am discussing today is only one layer, which is that of how caste has interacted with occupations in the cotton textile mills over a period of 135 years. So one of the things that I thought intellectually is that whenever we talk about any social institution, we tend to pick up one particular point, whichever period that is, and then we make conclusion based on that particular information, which in itself is not a problem. We say that, okay, whichever gender or caste has become weaker now in urban setting, or it doesn't matter. And I thought, as a student as well, I thought maybe it would be nice to look at a longer period, to look only at the same industry and see what exactly happens to these institutions over a period of time. And it is through that inquiry that I began this particular paper, which looks at the occupational shift, but specifically looking at caste as a social institution. So the question here is simple. Like, to what extent did caste-based occupational norms persist in modern urban manufacturing industries? That's the question, which is a very classic question for sociologists or economic historians or economists as well, but very few have dealt with such a question. Now, as far as the data is concerned, Census of India provides a very detailed micro data on the city, on the industry, and it gives all kinds of information related to what we need for writing the paper. Then I have several other data points and surveys conducted by the factory owners or the various scholars. Then I have my own data conducted in 2009 among the textile mill workers. All the factories closed down in 2006, so 2006 is the final date for closure, although my data was conducted in 2009. So that's the mapping I tried to do. So obviously, like any other study, particularly a longitudinal study which maps 100 plus years, there are data limitations. But nonetheless, I thought it's important to do such exercise. At the same time, I have used Times of India archives, which is very easily available these days. You can just do like keyword search and you get all the articles. But then there are also some Marathi magazines which are important, especially for the city of Mumbai. As I said, this is my initial work, and I really hope to do a more detailed work in the next 2-3 years. So I will be going through various reports and other kinds of studies and newspapers uh, to work on this project. So here we go now. So there are three keywords which drive this paper. So one is caste, third is capitalism, and then we have this city. So as far as caste is concerned, we go back to 200 BCE, because this is where you have the consolidation of caste norms in the text called Manusmriti that laid down rules of behavior for various caste groups as well as gender. But then there is a huge gap. We are now then talking of the industrial capitalism, that is 19th century. So now what has these something which was codified in 200 BCE has to do with industrial capitalism, and that we will see in a bit. And again, we are talking of an industrial context and industrial capitalism in a urban context. So it's again 19th century period. I won't spend much time on this one, but while discussing caste, people tend to use what is it called, that pyramid kind of structure, which I think does not do justice to it, because of the population that is actually, it does not match the population size. Anyway, so just to put briefly, that's the caste structure most of you are familiar with. But what is important here is the untouchables, and they got added nearly around 400 AD. Now, again, I'm not going to go into the details of this part, but this is just for your knowledge that as far as the rights are concerned, as far as the caste norms are concerned, they decided that certain groups will have more rights, certain groups will have less rights. Essentially, the rights flow from top to the bottom. So those at the top have the most rights, and as we go down, groups have less rights, and absolutely bottom, no rights whatsoever. And that applies to social, political, economic, and cultural arenas. So, and this is the way caste frameworks is. So if you want to know whether caste norms actually have influence in the modern setting, you need to first know what exactly are the norms, without which we can't test whether caste operated or not. So, of course, by and large, it's a common knowledge that the Brahmins do the priestly work, the Kshatriya, the warrior, the Vaishya, the trading, and the Shudras were supposed to serve the three castes above them. Now, as far as Manusmriti is concerned, it details very clearly what exactly all these groups should do if there is sort of a crisis, that if you cannot carry out your livelihood by doing the occupation assigned to your caste group. So if you look at the first one, it's like a Brahmin unable to subsist by his peculiar occupation, that is the priestly occupation, may live according to the law applicable to Kshatriya, or he may adopt a Vaishya mode of living, employing himself in agriculture and rearing cattle, engaging in trade with the exception of some commodities. Now, if you go down, a Kshatriya who has fallen in distress may subsist by the mode of life of Vaishya, but not of a Brahmin. If you further go down, a Vaishya who is unable to subsist by his own duties may even maintain himself by the Shudra mode of life. Okay? But that facility is not available. So one principle that we see codified in Manusmriti is that of flexibility for some and inflexibility for others. So as a Brahmin, you can actually take up any other occupation for livelihood, but not that of a Shudra. Likewise, when it comes to the Kshatriya can do something below the Kshatriya, but not that of a Brahmin. Okay? And a Vaishya can take up Shudra occupation, but not anything above. So the essential principle that we see here is about mobility for some, like maybe extra mobility for certain groups, then mobility for some, and immobility for others. Okay? And that's the way the text actually defines who can do what kind of work. Now, this is the way generally texts are. This is the basic knowledge. But I think as far as caste and occupation is concerned, very few scholars usually go into the text. But I thought it's also important to see that if we are so much talking about caste and occupation, let's actually see what the text says about occupational mobility. So it's not just people think that they can do anything. Actually, the text gives them the right to be mobile. All right. So now as far as capitalism is concerned, this kind of division of labor is not sustainable under capitalism because skill is given priority. And there is then scope for occupational mobility. As far as city is concerned, we all are familiar with various kind of novels, films, and literature on urban spaces that it offers individuals to be anonymous and it is full of possibilities. Okay. Now, if that is the case of capitalism and city, now if we combine the two together in a capitalist city, what exactly do we see? But before we get into my findings, just a few notes about the theoretical kind of formulations around caste and occupations. So historically, like from 1940s or even a little around that time, there are Marxist scholars who have spoken about occupational shifts and modernization theorists. Both of them actually agree on one thing, both modernization theorists as well as Marxist theories, that employers will actually prioritize individual skills rather than the social background of individuals. That both of these scholars felt that. Both the scholars felt that gender, caste, religion, race, this will become irrelevant in modern industrial urban settings. Because because the force of capitalism, the force of urbanization is so strong that this kind of identities will become irrelevant and capitalists will be interested only in the skill of the individual and nothing else. So bottom line is that caste is an aberration, it's an anomaly for urban industrial setting. So from 1950s to nearly 1990s, more or less scholars have said the same thing, that caste actually will not matter in urban setting. Various answers, various propositions were given. But one of the limitations of these kind of claims by sociologists or even historians was that these claims were rarely tested with empirical evidence. Okay? So empirical evidence means you can take a large scale data, survey data, you can conduct long interviews. So idea is that you need some evidence to actually test whether this is relevant or not. And what essentially this exercise meant was invisibilization of caste. That first you don't collect the data, and first of all there is no long-term exercise on testing the claim. So you have an assumption which is perfectly fine, but then as scholars we go and test those assumptions, either with statistical data, newspaper reports, all kinds of reports, whichever source is available for you, or interviews. Interestingly, from 1870s to 1930s, you have all kinds of British colonial reports, you have academic scholars, all of them have gathered information on the individual social background, such as their caste, race, gender, and of workers particularly, because I'm interested on the factory workers. I mean, the census is amazing with all kind of information, but I'm interested only on workers. 1947, interestingly, India gets independence, and the Indian state decides that officially they will not gather any information on individuals' caste background, with the exception of scheduled caste and scheduled tribes, because there were constitutional provisions for these two groups, and therefore the state has to make welfare provisions. But with the exception of these two groups, the state consciously decided that they are not going to gather any kind of data. Of course, there were arguments which we can go into during the question and answer session. Now, interestingly, this is a state policy, that the state, as far as their own data is concerned, their own reports, they will not gather information on caste. But when it comes to academic scholarships who are based in different universities in 1940s on 50s onwards, who are in various research institutes across the country. Interestingly, they also followed the nationalist diktat that we don't want to gather this kind of data. So there is a convergence. Technically, scholars do not have to necessarily follow what the state does because they're independent and they can pretty much collect the data and check the social processes. So essentially what has happened is we have a huge gap of scholarship from 1950s onwards where we have few people in very exceptional cases who gathered the data on caste, particularly in factories, and they also calculated the numbers whether caste has impact on occupation choices, their housing. So this is kind of thing that got missing from 1950 onwards. There are minor exceptions, but by and large, the broader trend is that scholars pretty much followed the nationalist kind of diktat. So this, of course, create a lot of problem for scholars like me who are now interested in doing a long history. But as I said, with all the limitation, we use all the resources and then try to write a story. Now, so that's so far as the theoretical approaches are concerned. Now let's talk about caste and political economy. Now, if we look at the distribution of occupations as per the caste norms, which continues to remain a very important element here, is that caste occupations are allocated to subcaste or the groups, caste groups, the jatis, and not to individuals. Okay, that's the most important part here. And that's as far as village political economy is concerned. The second important aspect is that in the village political economy, and that remains very much functional till 1960s, 70s, or even 80s, that there was little or no monetary compensation for the services performed. And most importantly, rather than individuals, the subcaste received the compensation. There could be variations here and there, but by and large what is important is that individual is not the unit for assigning occupation. It is the group that one belongs to. When it comes to the caste hierarchy, untouchables received meager compensation, also in kind, and in most cases were at the mercy of caste nobles. Now, in contrast to village political economy, 1860s onwards, you have industrialization taking place. And what does the modern industrial context does? The first thing it does is it begins to treat individual for monetary compensation. Now, that's a massive departure from rural political economy. And that is also a departure from the rural socio-economic structure. That first of all, monetary compensation was not present. And second, here individual becomes eligible for monetary compensation. Now, against this background, my argument is that as far as occupational choices are concerned, they were influenced by caste-based notions of occupational inflexibility and immobility. And we have already, I have explained what exactly are the notions of caste-based mobility and immobility. The second point is that the socially superior castes, the dominant castes, and I'll explain that when I explain the data, and the Shudras, they actually moved between the least desirable to the most prestigious jobs in the textile mills. Untouchables, Dalits, were restricted to work in the least desirable occupations. Not only that, they were actively prohibited from entering the most prestigious jobs inside the modern urban factories. So when we talk about the weakening of caste in urban settings, it is actually prominent more among the non-untouchable castes. Okay, so all the four, the Varna hierarchy that I showed in the last slide, among that there is weakening because people are moving between least desirable to the most desirable occupations. And that is a sign of weakening, but that principle did not apply to the untouchables, who was largely restricted to the least desirable occupations. And of course, even when we say there is weakening of caste, there is a pattern of caste whereby you have socially superior caste and dominant castes. In the case of Bombay, it is the Marathas, who cornered a larger share of jobs. All right. So this is quickly at the very beginning of industrialization, what exactly are the patterns? The patterns that we see is that the capitalist or the industrialist rely on caste-based skills. So among Muslims, there are Julaha Muslims who are the weavers caste among the Muslims. And we see that absolute dominance of Muslims, both men and women, in the weaving departments in the textile mills. And what the census tells us is the extremely low proportion of Hindu of other caste, which means except untouchable, all Hindus. And the proportion is extremely less here. So you can see that the capitalists are relying on the existing skilled population, which is directly linked to a particular caste. There is negligible presence of Dalit men and absolute absence of Dalit female in the industries, which is also goes against the popular assumptions that Dalit may have been the earliest migrants to the city. Okay? The reason simply being the cost of migration and also being tied up to the rural political economy, that you could not just go away. Now, as the industries expanded, what we see here is there is an increase of the Muslim workers from 6,000, 391 to 9,635. This is a span of 11 years. But more importantly, except for untouchable, the rest of the Hindus increased phenomenally from 4,000 to 27,000. So that's a massive expansion. Um, the kind of, there are famines in the rural parts of Maharashtra and other parts of the country that forces many people to go to the cities, and there are several other factors. But even with this phenomenal increase, Muslims continue to dominate the what is called the hand section, like this is the most skilled work within the workforce. So the rest of the Hindus, you have barely presence. And Dalits are still absolutely marginal in the workforce, and both men and women. Socially, what happens is the non-Brahmin movement in Maharashtra, which was led by Jyotirao Phule, they end up opening an office of Satyashodak Samaj in 1874. It's also the sheer flow of workers that actually also sees a social kind of churning in urban cities. And also Bombay happens to be the place where the the social organizers associated with Satyashodak movement establishes the first labor union organization, whatever you call, in the country, the Bombay Mill Hands Association. Then between the two world war, there is a massive kind of expansion of workers. We have 89,000 workers. The patterns are the absolute dominance of the Maratha men and women in the workforce. Dalits have notable share, but not significant. Overall, Muslims proportion is merely 2.5%. And there are other castes which are known as now the other backward caste. They are in some minor proportion. So Marathas, which is also the dominant caste, we will talk about it in a bit, like originally a Shudra caste, but through the political kind of events, they achieved like a Kshatriya status. But that's the mobility part here. Okay. Among women, also you have these variations. So I've already mentioned the Maratha women up, but there are women from other groups also, which are very much present. But in 1911, we don't have any information on the Brahmins working in the factories. But by 1921, again, there is a massive increase, like nearly threefold. And this time we have Brahmin workers going up to 6.8%. Now, several of these Brahmins are migrants from Uttar Pradesh because these are the points of migration. So the overwhelming migration in the Mumbai textile mills came from Western Maharashtra, the 4-5 districts, and the Konkan region. Several districts from the United Province, or now the Uttar Pradesh, few from Andhra Pradesh, 1 or 2 districts. So these are 4-5 major points, and 1 district point from Gujarat. That's it. So otherwise, there is no, but compared to any industrial center in the country, this is by far the most cosmopolitan workforce. Marathas continue to retain their dominance, and by 20s, Bombay is also one of the cities where you have all kinds of political activities taking place. You have the establishment of Communist Party, the Muslim League, the Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh, the socialists, the moderates, you have the anti-caste groups. All of them begin to have a considerable presence from 1920s onwards, and their presence also shaped occupational choices inside the factories. The reason we have to mention political parties because they also participated in the labor organization and on strikes and various activities. One of the things that is very classic of the urban context, which was not possible in the rural settings, in the rural socio-economic structure, is the challenge to the caste-based occupational norms. So the kind of occupation that you are supposed to do in the village socio-economic structure, there was less possibility to challenge that. In Mumbai, interestingly, the modern conditions offered that possibility. Dalit workers, although very small in proportion, really 9 to 10%, but they were successfully mobilized by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. In fact, this is the time for the emergence of organized Dalit politics in India. This is also the center for that. So that's why the study on Mumbai and the textile mills offers insights into various social and political movements as well. So just one example, there is a strike in 1928. Various groups decide to come together and go on strike. And it is during this strike, Ambedkar raises the question that, look, Dalits are not allowed, particularly the Mahar caste, they are not allowed to enter the weaving department on the excuse of getting polluted. And he challenged that particular restriction, and he said that as far as Dalit weavers are concerned, they need to be, the Dalit workers should be also allowed to be part of the weaving section, which was the highest paid department, as well as the most respected occupation in the textile industry. Again, the most desirable and the most prestigious occupation. Okay, so he challenged that particular kind of caste-based norms, and of course the unions had to agree, and they also put this as a demand. In fact, he also arranged the training of Dalit weavers through the weavers from the Barar region, that is in the Vidarbha area, and they were brought in the 1928-29 so that Dalits in Bombay would be trained to become weavers. However, for such initiatives, the Maratha workers went on strike at various places, and these are the Maratha workers who were predominantly organized by the Communist Party in Bombay, and they refused the entry of the Dalit or the Mahar workers. Now, the refusal is actually not surprising because it is expected that the way caste norms function. What is more important and remarkable here is the possibility of claiming the most desirable jobs for Dalits. And that is something that urban industrial context offers. And that's something that's absolutely different from the rural structure. Now, I have started the story with the dominance of Muslims and particularly Muslim weavers. And interestingly, while the Marathas are able to resist the entry of Mahars or Dalits inside the factories, they were not able to, they were not successful in resisting the employment of Julha Ansari Muslim workers. Part of the reason was that the mill owners gave preference to the Julha Ansari workers for their traditional weaving skills. In fact, not only they gave preference to Muslim workers, they actually were entrusted with one of the most fancy and one of the most sophisticated looms to the Muslim workers. And the Julha Ansari workers were, skilled and they were sought after to an extent that they pretty much appropriated important areas of control over their labor. They refused to work in the night shifts. They also bargained for better wages. And in fact, their wages, the wages of Muslim weavers were reputed and they were known to be higher than the Hindu counterparts, predominantly the Marathas. However, as the industry expanded, in terms of overall jobs, the Marathas took over, but the Muslim workers were concentrated in certain mills and they were very much preferred by the mill owners themselves. However, as the industry expanded, what we see is that there is more opportunities for various groups. And once the Marathas, particularly, or the other OPC groups, they have more opportunities in other departments that opens up possibilities for Dalits in the least desirable occupation. Uh, that particularly, I mean, if you look at the paper, the data clearly shows that. I'm just highlighting, the most important findings here. And the ring department, even in the ring department, which is still the least desirable occupation, you still have, of the total workers, 42% Marathas and 40% Dalits, which means that among Marathas also, there is a competition to enter the weaving section. But they still continue to retain the jobs in the ring department, which is the least desirable occupation. However, although Marathas and Dalits may be working in the same department, there is a massive difference between these two groups. Firstly, the wages of the workers in the ring department are nearly half or quarter of that of the weavers. And Dalits were particularly vulnerable because they did not have farmlands, they were landless laborers, and because they could not go back to their villages when there were moments of unemployment. And in fact, this is one of the things scholars have highlighted, that the strikes were successful, the industrial strikes, because workers would go back to their villages during the long drawn strikes. And that was a choice not available for Dalits. The last point here is about the grain shop dealers. If you think about, I mean, you'll have to read literature now. You may not understand the economy, because with this whole retail shopping online, there was a time when people would go to the shop and buy their monthly groceries. And in several cases, the grain shop dealer would extend credit especially to the workers during strikes. But that that kind of deal was not available again to the Dalits. So that makes them vulnerable again as far as the overall economy is concerned. But if you now move towards 1950s to 1990s, just one point here, that as far as India is concerned, these textile jobs fall under what we consider as the formal sector of the economy, okay? Which means these are the jobs where you get the best paid employment, you get the best social security provisions, healthcare provisions, and all kinds of social security benefits that you might think associated with a good job, like a sarkari government job, okay? Even in 1950s, of the 100 jobs, the secured employment, what I call, was only available to 8 to 9 people in this country, okay? So 92% of this country's workforce was in what is known as famously the informal or unorganized sector, which means you have low wages, absolutely abysmal working conditions, no social security provisions whatsoever. So the best paid employment is only 8%. It has now come down to 2 to 3%, okay? And so 8% was the maximum, and these textile workers were part of that 8%. And that is the reason these jobs were again the most sought after jobs. India attains independence, so it clearly delegitimizes the caste-based kind of frame of governance, and it bans the practices of untouchability. Then there are several legislations which offer more protection to the workers in the factories. At the same time, this is a long period, as I said, and I'm happy to talk more in the question answer session, is also a period where we see massive decline of Muslim workers. There are several factors. One is partition, and which resulted into the Hindu-Muslim riots on the eve of independence. Now, interestingly, 1960s is also the time of technological transformation. Now, this is an aspect I'm interested in exploring further, but from the initial reports, what I know is that from this time onwards, the Marathas were now able to exclude the Muslim workers by arguing for the notion of pollution. Now, this notion of pollution, I have argued in my this paper or other paper, that is different from the caste-based notion of pollution. Through my interviews with the Muslim workers, I have learned of a new category called karahiyat, which means nausea, disgust, hatred, hideousness, and that essentially has a negative connotation. These are negative emotions. And what I've argued is that the negative emotions has an impact on the occupational choices of the Muslim workers. And that is the beginning of that, at least for the case of Mumbai textile mills, that 60s. 70s, I have done interviews with trade union leaders where there was an explicit anti-Muslim bias. There were notices written outside the textile mills that Muslim workers will not be hired. Okay, and 92 rights obviously is a major change. And of course, there is a 82, 83 strike, and I will again happy to talk about it later. One of the interesting trends again is that of the decline of women workers. Now, if you look at the figures of 1920s, women workers were nearly 25% of the total workforce. It drops to nearly 16% in 1940, and by 1955, it's just 70%. If you go further deep into those figures, by 1970s, late 70s, women are barely 1% or even 0.5% of the total workforce. Technological transformation is given as one of the alibis, but also scholars have noted that women were far more militant and organized as far as their in terms of organizing their demands and bargaining from the mill owners. And that was one of the reasons that the union leaders and the management actually came together to get rid of women workers. Now, some patterns suggest that the proportion of Dalits increased, and this is late 70s figures, from 0.6 to 5%. Now, one of the ways to treat is this bias sampling? We don't know, because this is a very small sample that we have. But then there was also, 70s is a period of the initiatives from the social welfare department in terms of affirmative action, now what is understood as the social justice ministry. But there is also, Bombay is known for the birth of Dalit Panthers movement, which actually created a major challenge for the then ruling government. And it is likely that under this pressure, the government tried to encourage employment of Dalits into the weaving department. However, from the newspaper reports, we know that only one government officer responded positively, and that is the factory owned by the central government. And therefore, what we see is that even with the ban on untouchability, the caste Hindus, particularly the non-untouchable, successfully resisted the recruitment of Dalits as weavers. So even till late 70s, we don't have a massive change as far as the weaving section is concerned. We are almost done now. Now, as far as 2006 marks the final closure. Now, even when the factory is closed down permanently, what exactly is the situation when the factories are closing? Even in that moment, we see that the Marathas retain dominance in both the least as well as the most desirable occupations. The overall proportion reduced significantly. Now, then there is one pattern which I have noted, which is the Padmashali weavers from Andhra or Telangana. They made their presence felt in the weaving departments. But there is a sharp decline in the number of Muslims. It again came down to probably 0.1 or 2%. Again, there is also decline of Dalits and their continued presence only in the least desirable occupations, even when the industrialization was now getting done with. And then there are negligible presence of women workers as well. Now, to conclude, the first part is that the ability to move between the least desirable and the most desirable occupations provides the key to understanding the functioning of caste in modern urban industrial settings. Second, caste norms of mobility enable the dominant castes, Shudras, and the upper caste to move between occupations, and caste norms of immobility were experienced by Dalits, who were actively restricted from entering the best paid jobs. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sumeet, for this very wonderful and very comprehensive presentation. Like literally the entire chapter that I read in the morning, I could just see it over the PPT slides. So thank you. We'll open it up for discussion now. Like any remarks, reflections, questions are welcome. Even if you have not gone through the entire text, maybe, yeah, please.
Thank you so much, sir, for the presentation. So you mentioned that textile decline period 1950s to 90s, there was a decline of women workers. So when you say that, do you mean like particularly in the weaving department? Because like in other departments of the whole like weaving cycle and the textile cycle, like ginning, spinning, like we usually see dominance of women workers. Like even now, they might not be on the looms, and there have been increasingly less and less of women on the looms, but in the pre-loom activities we see more of women. So what kind of women workers did you mean there?
Okay, yeah. Thank you for that question. And as I said, first it's a very long period, and then there are several shifts. So I tried my best to accommodate various shifts in today's discussion. As far as women are concerned, they were largely concentrated in something called winding and reeling department, which were at least until the 1940s were manually done. Okay, and that remained the case for women, even the tiny proportion till the closure. With mechanization, the men took over. So this was considered as a female occupation until 1930s, until the mechanization happened. As I said, also there is also political reason. So women were not necessarily part of weaving ever, actually. It was predominantly a male occupation. So I may not, there may have been some confusion, but women were never part of this. Women were part of winding and reeling departments, and also some other department like ring and other departments. And their proportion from that reduced significantly. And the number only went down from 25% to 16, 7, and nearly 0. Like maybe 1 or 2 by early 1980s. That's it, like maybe 1%. So overall, there has been a decline of women, but women were concentrated historically for a very long period only in the winding and reeling departments. And like just to give like, I don't know if I can explain. So the process of cotton production, I can't explain that, clearly, but the process is that a raw cotton comes from the farm, it is cleaned, and then the thread is made, then the thread is put onto something, and then that particular thread thing goes to the weaving department, cloth, then it goes to coloring, cleaning, dyeing, and then folding department, and finally the cloth is produced. So there is a long process. Okay, so one process then was women dominated before the weaving section. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you for the presentation, sir. It was really enriching. However, I mean, the question that I'm asking you might not be,
Go ahead.
relevant to
Go
the
ahead.
particular.
No disclaimers.
But yeah, I mean, whenever we talk of caste, which plays a very significant role in today's time as well, and in the contemporary time as well, be it politics or be the social fabric of the country. But why is it always Manusmriti and in the British era, the advent of EIC, East India Company, that we take these two parallels when we are talking of caste? What happens in between? I mean, there's no caste factors making or coming into the social fabric, disturbing it in the Mughal era or prior to that. Thank you.
Thank you. See, the reason we go back to Manusmriti is because that is one of the most consolidated text on how a society should operate on the basis of caste norms. So that is the text. Okay. So if you want to study anything about Christianity, you go back to Bible, or you go back to the Old Testament. Okay. So that's not a problem with that. Now, the point here is that why are we talking about colonial thing then, right? Recent historical work has clearly shown how it operated even in the pre-colonial structures. There is a good book called The Merchants of Virtue, which talks about, I think, 17th or 18th century role of caste in Rajasthan. Okay, and this is based on the sources in whatever the Marwadi language. I don't know what is the language in Rajasthan. So those sources. So I think as scholars, we need to be open to what kind of evidence we are using. Okay, and the norms are laid there. Now, if we don't see any consistency with the current kind of distribution of workers, then these norms are useless. Okay, the norms are only, we go back to the norms to study whether there is any relevance or not. Now, if we want to study caste and occupation, then we have to see that the most codified form of caste, which is Manusmriti, does it say anything about occupation? And it does. Now, does that has a relevance for contemporary thing? We have to check. So the only relevance I found is about mobility and immobility. That within the non-untouchable caste, there is a mobility. That if you look at the Shudras, okay, it does not offer mobility in Manusmriti actually. But in practice now, the Shudras are actually able to move between the most desirable occupation as well, the most prestigious, and that is a change of caste. That Marathas are actually a Shudra origin, which is most dominant caste. But through various kind of political changes, they are able to claim a socially superior status and also claim a larger share of jobs. That is again going against what the caste norm said. Okay? So we have to, as scholars, we have to see what it is there and what does the current situation say. Nobody is saying that exactly that is being reproduced. But what is important for us as scholar is to understand there is a principle of mobility and immobility. That changed. And if at all, I made one point clear that in terms of weakening of caste, actually that weakening is part of, for the non-untouchable group particularly, that there is massive churning happening due to the arrival of modern industrial jobs. And that actually breaks the kind of division in the rural socio-economic structure. Also, because Prachi mentioned at the very beginning about the methodological part. So feel free to ask questions on related to method, if whatever your curiosity, and no need of any disclaimer, just go ahead. Yeah. Please, yes, madam.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed your paper and the talk.
Thank you.
You know what really struck me, and I think it's an aspect that I haven't seen in a lot of the writings, is about the trade union politics and the caste-based character of trade union politics. I think maybe you have written another paper on it, but it seemed so interesting that this we have seen in Andhra also, that the caste base of the communist movement was actually led by rich peasants. So, whether you look at the Kammas, the Reddys, sections of the Reddys, or in this case, the Marathas. So it's very interesting that then the Dalit resistance actually comes in Bombay, at least in Mumbai, from the Ambedkar politics. So in a sense, the caste question, and you began with that, was never really addressed by the communists.
Yeah.
Much later, they're forced to reckon with caste and deal with it. So I thank you so much, because I think I saw parallels, but nobody has really in this kind of writing highlighted this aspect.
Yes, thank you. Just one small note here is that, there are several things we all are working on. This is one of them. One of the ways in which the labor, particularly kind of strikes movement, has been looked at with scholars who have more sympathies on the left, which is perfectly fine, or communist sympathies. But what they have not, they have done injustice by inflating the role of communist in the labor politics. So the 28th strike I specifically refer, that is the first moment where, which shows a unified labor action against the capitalist as well as the colonial state. Because it is after this strike, the colonial state actually arrests all the leaders in the Meerut conspiracy case. Okay? And therefore this strike is very important. And it is in this strike you have the moderates led by N.M. Joshi, you have the communists who are also there, then you have Ambedkarites, Dalits particularly, who associate more with the N.M. Joshi kind of faction, and then there are other kind of socialists. So there are 3-4 groups, and they have pretty much influence on various castes and communities. And that is something I am working on right now, to show that it's not one ideology that, because the assumption is that communists must have taken over. This is not. The communists had to come to terms with all the liberals and moderates to actually agree upon a common agenda that they can then further go on a unified strike. And it is during this strike that all these tensions really came up. Because what happens after 28 successful strike, in 29 strike, there is no unified action. Because the Muslim workers as well as the Dalit workers, particularly led by Ambedkar, argue that, look, we have had a long 6-month strike, now we can't go on strike again. Because already we have undergone financial distress, there is indebtedness, and we can't afford to do that. And that's why it's a failed strike. And then there are different kind of tensions that come in 1929. But yeah, I'm hoping I'll finish that thing as well at some point.
Just to add from there, great talk, and looking forward to reading it. So, post independence, this consolidation of Maratha identity, also probably Maharashtrian identity through Shiv Sena, has also been very instrumental in the weakening of, if at all there existed, a working class mobilization there. So then, but Maratha was also looking like a dominant working, with respect to the proportion, they are also in good number there. So has this been a part of the your inquiry in any case?
Yeah, see, I mean, there are several identities that you have highlighted. One is of Marathi, which is a linguistic identity. Second is of Maratha, which is a caste identity. Okay, so there is a difference between these two identities.
I'm particularly interested in rise of Shiv Sena
Yeah.
and weakening of working class.
It's honestly speaking, there is no direct correlation. Okay, because what happens? The Maharashtra state is formed in 1960. Shiv Sena is formed in 1966. Okay, and their trade union kind of politics begins in 1980. So we really are talking of a long time. By 1960s mid or late, there are two kinds of divisions that take place. Inside the factories, socialist, communist, all kind of people become important. But outside the factories, Shiv Sena is important at the neighborhood elections level. So a person might be a communist supporter inside the factory. That person is a Shiv Sena supporter outside the factory. So already one person is showing dual political loyalty, which I write about. Okay, so it's not that one is, somehow they come up and everything is broken. So that's number one. Second, 1962 Indo-China war happens. Then Communist Party split into two factions, CPI and CPM. 1964, Communist Party of India, Marxist, is formed. Within 3 years, there is a CPIM-led trade unions across the country. So within communists, there are two kinds of unions. Late 60s, there is the CPI-ML. Then all kinds of Maoist, Marxist, Leninist, all kind of parties, further splitting the unions. So the communists themselves are not unified. They are also themselves fighting against each other. Okay, forget Shiv Sena for a minute. They are themselves fighting. Now, whether Shiv Sena actually is influential, of course it is influential. It is backed by the state. The factory owners themselves are inviting Shiv Sena to be part of the union. And violence is very much part of industrial capitalism. The Gundaism is absolutely part of industrial capitalism. So there are communist gundas, there are Shiv Sena gundas, there are all kinds of gundas. So Bombay, it is Dada. There is a historian called Raj Chandavarkar who has written on the institution of Dada itself. There is a separate section in his book that what exactly Dada means and what can the Dada do. Okay, and Dada is not only somebody who recruits people, who brings. Dada is also somebody who will discipline the workforce inside the factories. But Dada is also somebody who will do violence against the political opponent. Okay, so the factory owners will also recruit Dadas. The unions also has their Dadas. So violence is very much part of industrial capitalism, without which industrial capitalism cannot be understood. Okay, so it's not that only Shiv Sena is Dadas. If you look at industrial politics, that ability to confront your political opponent physically is very important. And communists lost that ability from 60s onwards. So communists did not have the capacity to physically confront. The number of Dadas they had pretty much reduced. So therefore, rhetorically they say that there is a communist leader called Krishna Desai whose murder resulted in decline. No, communists were already in decline. Okay, because Dadas don't wait for the government. Dadas, you know, they settle their scores differently. So therefore, that particular violence is extremely important. And if you don't have the capacity to do violence, then you lose your turf. And that's what happened to communists. First, themselves they are splitting into various factions, and also their own children are very much part of the Shiv Sena movement. Several workers themselves are part of Shiv Sena movement. So they are voting for communists inside the factories, outside they are going and voting for Shiv Sena. And this pattern remained throughout 80s, 90s, even middle class employees, forget workers. Even middle class clerical bank employees union would be very much communist supporter inside the banks. At home they would be Shiv Sena supporters. So therefore this binary has to be broken. As a scholar, I mean, one may have inclination towards one thought or other, but as a scholar we have to be open to that information. So I hope that answers your question.
Hi sir, I just had one question. That you mentioned that you personally interviewed 924 mill workers, and I wanted to know, was there any hostility while you collected caste data from them, or any sort of violence as you mentioned?
No violence, no. I'm sitting here. Okay. First of all, I did field work for 14 months. Okay. For the first 10 months, I did qualitative interviews, and I was just spending a lot of time with the workers, the union, and unions of all shades. Proper RSS, right-wing leaning, to left-wing, to socialist, to moderate, everyone. No distinction there. Because I'm a researcher, I want to collect data. Okay. It's just so happened that, I had gained already trust in the 10 months that I was there. So when I actually went to conduct survey, all of them helped me, irrespective of their political affiliation. So they thought I'm doing a survey and they just want to help. That's it. On the question of caste, very few people actually objected. That was a marginal kind of, I wouldn't say disturbance either actually. Nobody was that hostile actually. It was like any other question. But I kept it for little later also. It's better to do that way. Because I have been teaching survey methods course in my school for 3-4 years. And more than the respondents, the students are the one who trouble me most. Okay, you first go and check, no, if somebody is troubling you or not. But the students themselves are so averse to asking the question. If you're not going to ask the question, how will you address the problem? If at all there is a problem. Or if you want to understand a society, how will you understand it? Good or bad, both ways. So I think much of this resistance come from the idea in post-independence India, that we are a modern nation and we should get rid of these backward kind of mentalities, and we should not even talk about it. Because we have to embrace this great Indian identity, and caste has no place in the modern Indian nation. Now, while as an objective stated one, it sounds great, as an idea it sounds great, but in practice it creates problems. Like with elections, with marriages, you have all kind of great matrimonial websites, newspapers, columns. So people are fine actually sharing their so much personal data in public, with phone numbers maybe even. And with websites, even your photos. I don't know what kind of gotra and everything. I mean, I'm not that expert on that level now. But I'm saying there is also dual behavior when we talk about caste. So I think as a student, as a researchers, I think it's better to be open and test the claim. If you don't find, it's done, job is done. At least that thing is not there, that if anyone asks you, what about this, you can say, I have tested, it has no relevance. But you need data for that. Yeah.
We'll just try to keep it brief. Guys, please.
You
Maybe both of you can ask, and then I can. Jaise bhi aapko theek lage.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor, for the detailed presentation. Actually, I have a question related to the Muslim weavers that you were talking about. So you talked about in a paper related to Karahayat, and you mentioned that the assumption that Muslim-dominated places where looked upon as a places of crime and prostitution. And later on, but in the early 90s, we see that these Muslim weavers were pretty much dominant in their in the weaving industry and had a very hold of the power with related to their um, the working hours and their wages. But later, after in 1950s, you talk about the decline of Muslim workers, and you also talk about the partition that might be an impact for the decline in Muslim workers. But one my specific doubt, which I'm not able to understand here, is 1950. We see the constitution coming in that era, and we see the caste-based framework of governance needs to be is dismantled, and the right caste-based rights are like the rights are discussed here. But I still don't see a flow in the decline of Muslim workers, specifically in the weaving industry, because how does it decline when there is a constitution coming in, the rights are being discussed there, but we see that decline. And also that earlier it was so much dominant, like, and now even the Marathas are also interrupting the Muslim workers, and they're denying their employment. So how does this happen apart from partition? And later on in 92 we also see the rights there. So yeah, thank you.
Maybe we collect one more question so that.
Is
Go
there
ahead.
something else?
Like you spoke about political mobilizations in 1920s. After 1950s, actually, my question is slightly related to what she also asked. Like with the constitution coming in, also, was there no active political mobilization by Dalits and Muslim workers, like in like post 1950s, especially with the constitution coming in, since they have been increasingly facing the exclusion, or if there was like maybe it wasn't successful even then.
Okay, thank you.
May I just
Add one thing.
not really okay, again, I understand that we are really short on
No,
time,
no, go
but
ahead,
it's
please.
just a very, it's not a question per se, but when I was reading it, it's just a reflection. It's something that I found very, very interesting. So it's mentioned that in the 1931 census data, the Kunbis and Marathas, they were shown together. So Marathas had basically persuaded the Kunbis to report themselves as Marathas, and they saw it as a great opportunity for social mobility and all. And then it just struck me, like when Manoj Jarange Patil's agitation for the reservation last year was at its peak. So one of the solutions that the Maharashtra government came out with was that Marathas ko Kunbi certificates de diya jaye, and then that is how they can claim reservation. And then there was opposition from both the communities. So both of them were like, no, that's not how it's going to be. So in the former case, in the early 20th century, maybe it's because of statistics and how the role of census and sort of ensuring numerical number, very the data of it all, right, to look like a numerical majority there. But now when it's about splitting resources through reservations or whatever, so it was just an interesting juxtaposition, so to say. Professor, we'll just, if you could respond to all the remarks or questions in 2 to 3 minutes, and then we can, yeah.
2 to 3 minutes. Okay.
Sorry.
Very briefly, I think somebody asked me about that why there is this contradiction. You have attained independence. So look, it's simple as that. There are two kind of norms that persist in society. One is caste, gender, religious-based norms, which means the society expects women to perform certain kind of role, behave in a certain manner, get clothed in a particular manner. These norms are social norms. That has nothing, constitution has nothing to do with the modern liberal rights, have nothing to do. Now 1950s, we have the constitution adoption of the most liberal democratic constitution, which gives equal rights to all citizens. But as far as its operational part is concerned, there is a conflict with the social norms. So there is conflict, there is a constant conflict between these two. So as far as law is concerned, everybody is equal. But the social norms say, no, not everybody is equal. We don't want to follow that. And that's why the conflict mostly arises. If everybody suddenly says that, oh, now we have adopted a constitution, let's treat everybody equally, we would be in a different world. But that has not happened, and that's why these patterns that we see, okay? But notionally speaking, that as in terms of legitimacy, that has no role to play. In terms of all the regressive social norms, they have no place in a modern liberal democratic society such as India, okay? Because it is governed by the constitution. It has no legitimacy, but they still operate, okay? So that is the short answer for your question. As far as Muslims are concerned, Uh, what I am developing another paper which is in the Economic and Political Weekly, which exclusively deals with the Muslim laborers, and that's where I have developed this concept in detail, is that karahiyat, which is a negative feeling towards Muslim. Now, the way I describe this concept is what are the sources of karahiyat? So there is negative feeling, it's clear. What are the sources of it? The one major source is the partition of this country, that Muslims are constantly blamed for the partition. Second is the beef eating. That differential food habits creates the feeling of nausea. Okay, and that kind of negative emotion is also transferred to other kind of foods eaten by Muslims. It could be also even simple vegetarian food. Now the third kind of factor which actually results into karahiyat, which is the negative feeling, is the prevalence of criminals from the community. But more importantly, it's not the number, it is actually the projection of the media and the cinema that reinforces the idea that these groups are belong to the crime world. Then of course the prostitution, that men are also not nice towards Muslim women, they are patriarchal, there is violence, Muslim women are subjected. These kind of images are also constantly projected. Okay, what I am arguing is that all of these also has an effect on the jobs when Muslims go. That they are also related to the crime, underworld, 90s bomb blasts, you know. So many well-meaning people, liberal, would also actually fall into this trap. Okay, and that's the answer, that as far as Muslims are concerned, they became victim of this kind of thing. The last part, and I'll come to your thing, it will take hardly some seconds. The Dalit Muslim thing is more a recent phenomena. Okay, the Muslims back then did not necessarily see them as the kind of marginal group. Okay, Muslims were claiming a different nation altogether. It was far more an empowered community in that sense. So there was, in some cases, there is some collaboration with Dalits, but that kind of alliance that we see now, there was no scope. So we can't look at the history from present, rather the past should inform the present. So in some way, that is the short answer. Now to Prachi's, your question, the answer changes depending on the century. If you ask me the question whether the Marathas and Kunbis are same, in 19th century the answer is yes. But if you move to 20th century, if you ask me the same question, I'll say the answer is no, because 1919 onwards, there are political reforms initiated by the colonial state where they are slowly giving powers to the people in country. And this is where the entire struggle for claiming political power begins. And through various kind of processes, the Marathas eventually begins to mark themselves as a distinct caste and community. There are associations which are formed. And then the porous boundary between the Maratha Kunbi completely gets blocked. And then Maratha ends up becoming a separate political bloc. Just to have their numbers higher, they do that, but it fails eventually. And that's why we always had a Maratha chief minister predominantly and never a Kunbi kind of chief minister. If the boundary between the Maratha and Kunbi were so porous, half of our chief minister could have been Kunbis also. Okay, so that is the answer, but we can have a longer discussion. And thank you everyone for all the questions.
Once again, thank you so much, Professor Sumeet. It was really wonderful, a very
A whole series of engagements, because you've unpacked so many layers. I was just trying to make sense. I must confess that since we've been working with textile workers now around 6-7 years,
20.
20 for you, but 6-7 years
for
for
you. Oh, okay.
us. The most interesting aspect for caste that has come out in a very different sense has been in the work we've been doing around Bhuj in Kutch area. And there is a huge representation of Muslim there, and so we had actually 2 artisans which just came 2 days back from a village close to Bhuj. Both are Khatris, Muslim community. And I would probably talk to you about this separately, Sumeet, because I've been grappling my head about how their perception of the dynamics of caste has really played out in the work they are doing. I mean, actually, the idea has been to look at the life cycle of the craft and then see their role in it. And there is a lot of epistemologies of caste-based knowledge systems that have been transferred across generations. So thank you so much for taking the time out. And thank you guys. I know for students who are visiting, that's great, but we also had those who were on campus dropping in.